So this is our main presentation inside the EPA. Dr. Vallianatos will discuss his book, Poison Spring, which documents in detail the EPA's corruption and misuses of science and public trust. In its half-century of existence, the EPA has repeatedly reinforced the chemical industrial complex by endorsing deadly chemicals, botching field investigations, and turning a blind eye to toxic disasters and swallowing the claims of the industry. Come find out from an EPA insider about how the EPA has allowed our lands and waters to be poisoned with more toxic chemicals than ever. Dr. Vallianatos completed his Ph.D. in European and Greek history at the University of Wisconsin, completed his postdoctoral studies in the history of science at Harvard University. He worked on Capitol Hill in the areas of international food and agricultural politics and development, as well as for the UN Development Program. He worked for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for 25 years, where he saw the workings of this organization from the inside. Please welcome Dr. Vallianatos. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I'm delighted to be here with you tonight, and I want to thank Susan Downs for this honor, and I want to thank all of you for being here. I will be talking primarily about the environment, so what best way to start by citing that this idea of living in harmony with the natural world has been with us for millennia, and I'm citing here something from Hippocrates, who is considered as the father of medicine. And health, this is a wonderful definition of health by a very distinguished physician of the 3rd century BCE, Herophilus, who worked in Alexandria, Egypt, in the 3rd century. So without health, forget about anything else. And, but we don't seem to learn much from history, it seems. I'm starting now with this picture from 1948. This was called the Donora smog in Pennsylvania, in a little mill town called Donora. And maybe 20 people died out of it, but it tells you what happens with the whole idea of industrialization. Industrialization took hold in the 19th century. People believed because of the different inventions in science and technology that could mechanize everything, not only to make our world easier, but also to dominate the natural world. And they forgot that there are consequences to all that. This was 1948, and 1947, as you can see in this advertisement, we have DDT, and it's been celebrated like it was the magic bullet. You can see in the advertising how careless the industrialized version of technology had become in this country. DDT is an organochlorine. It persists for decades in the environment, and it was really wiping out insects and birds for decades in this country. And we have to wait almost down to 1962 for Rachel Carson to write that wonderful book, Silent Spring. And Rachel Carson said that, you know, we have overdone it. So she studied the scientific literature about insects and about birds and about DDT, and she concluded that this was the main culprit. And it took another, she died from cancer in 1964, and it took down to 1972, 2 years after the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency by a Republican administration, that of Richard Nixon, to eventually ban DDT. And of course, the chemical industry denounced Rachel Carson as a spinster, as a woman who knew nothing about biology. The same kind of charges they turned around and they hurled against the EPA in 1972, when EPA, with the Republican administration, had the courage to say enough is enough. So they got rid of DDT. This is a picture that is really classic. You can see a big truck with a DDT, spray DDT, and the children going into the DDT. Did they know that this was dangerous? I'm sure scientists did know that it was dangerous in 1962 and 1972. Indeed, EPA banned it because they were concerned that this chemical was a human carcinogen as well, as a terrible ecological disaster. When World War II came to an end, soldiers were sprayed with DDT for all sorts of problems, medical problems, and they were used. And we come now to 1979. This is the time that I joined EPA. 79, I had already completed my studies, postdoctoral studies at Harvard. I had written my first book. And I'll tell you a little bit about that first book so you can understand why I'm speaking the way I do. I got this fellowship as a junior fellow at Harvard, and I studied the transfer of science and technology from this country to Latin America. So I went to Colombia, and the idea was to find out what was this business of industrialized agriculture, what was it doing in a country like Colombia. Because at Harvard and in all sorts of, in the United States, we were having this music of the Green Revolution. Some of you might remember the idea of Green Revolution. And by Green Revolution, they meant the industrialization of agriculture, the intensification of production, growing of a lot of tremendous amounts of wheat, of corn, soybeans, and so on. Indeed, the Rockefeller Foundation had sent and funded the industrialization of agriculture in Mexico, for instance. When I went to Colombia and I was a guest of the Ford Foundation, I had a wonderful connection there with an agronomist who had studied at the same university I had got my Ph.D. at the University of Wisconsin, and he spoke excellent English, so he and I drove all over Colombia. So we were talking to farmers, we were talking to government officials, foundation people, and I remember at that time, and it still exists to this day, there was an International Center for Agricultural Research in Cali, Colombia. So we went to that center, and the people at the center, once they discovered that I was from Harvard, I was writing a book about it, and all this, so they treated me royally. So they saw me all the new experiments they were doing and so on, and the question was, what are you doing all these things for? Oh, they say in order to increase production, to help the peasants and so on. I said, that's fine. So my friend and I, we drove away from the center, and every 5 miles we stopped. And we would go unannounced and knock at the door of people and said, tell us what exactly are you growing, and do you have any connections with the International Center? And the peasants were looking and said, what International Center? They hadn't the slightest clue that this center was in their own neighborhood, which of course convinced me that everything they told me was not true. So after I completed my research, I went back to Cambridge. I threw away the manuscript I had written, and I rewrote the book. And I said in the book, fundamentally, that we are actually misguided by trying to suggest that we know better ways to grow corn or soybeans than these peasants. They have been doing this for millennia. And the director of the center that I was a junior fellow did not like that at all. He said, he came to my office, he said, hey, Dr. Vallianatos, what are you trying to do? I said, Dr. Ravel. This was Roger Ravel, by the way, from California. And the University of California, San Diego, has a college named after him because he was a distinguished scientist. In fact, he was one of the first who talked about climate change. This is 1979, it's 1978, 77, so on. So I said to Dr. Ravel, I mean, you can see from the footnotes, I have been documenting everything I say in this book. And I said the whole business of the Green Revolution is kind of a political slogan. It's not real. Because once you transfer your tractors, your synthetic fertilizers, your insecticides, then you put these people, these poor people that are trying to make a living, out of business. Because the guy that you transfer your technology gets bigger, more money, he can buy up the little guys, and then those little guys begin to walk towards California. Something that continues to this very day. So that's the background. So with that kind of background, Dr. Ravel helped me, and I found my first job at the Office of Technology Assessment, which was a Capitol Hill Joint Committee. And of course, President Reagan abolished it, so it doesn't exist anymore. But anyway, it functioned for a number of years. And they were doing studies for subcommittee chairpersons. And after a year, and then I worked for a congressman from Maryland, and after 2 years, I joined the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in 1979. So I went there with all the enthusiasm of a young man, with a book and all this. I thought I knew something, and I was ready. And of course, I learned a lot. So the first year was really very good. I worked with a biologist, and he had a small group that we were trying to figure out the best ways how to extract data from the industry. And we're talking about the chemical industry because that program dealt primarily with pesticides. The program, the office was called the Office of Pesticide Programs. What you see now is simply the cover of the magazine that they used to publish. And so I was pretty satisfied, and the person that was my supervisor was extremely very kind, and I liked it. But after he retired, after a year, and I moved on, slowly I began to get into trouble. Why trouble? The trouble was that I began to ask questions. They sent me for a couple of weeks of seminar in North Carolina to learn all about what happens when you spray a chemical and you have the farm worker picking up the crop. So they brought all sorts of experts, and the experts talked to us about skin absorption of the chemical, inhalation, and all the varieties of chemicals that they used for that. Some of these chemicals were organophosphates, which are related to chemical warfare stuff. And me being a historian, I said, "Oh, what is going on?" So I went to the office and I began to do my own research. I got information from the Library of Congress and all this. And then I wrote a very lengthy memorandum, documented with footnotes. So this is dangerous stuff. So I sent my memo to the supervisor I had then, who was a woman, and she was the deputy director of my division. And I said to her, "Dear so-so, here is what I discovered. What we're doing, spraying these chemicals, they are completely hazardous, you know." I said, in 1925, the nation signed a treaty that said no more chemical warfare. And I said, "I'm not suggesting we're fighting a chemical warfare right now, but I'm suggesting that the chemicals we use are related to chemical warfare agents, and therefore they have similar effects on human beings. So we should not be using these chemicals." I never got a response from her. And so my days began to get even worse. And I remember seeing my colleagues talking to each other very quietly. This is 1979, 1980. And what I learned by talking to them is that 3 years before I got there, a pathologist from the Food and Drug Administration named Adrian Gross had come across a laboratory in Chicago, Industrial Biotech Laboratory, which made up data. In other words, you, the chemical industry, pay them $100,000 to test your chemical X to find out whether, according to the law, cause unreasonable adverse effects on man and the environment. And for you to make money to keep having this clientele coming back to you for more and more, you just made up the numbers. So you produced a wonderful report that said, "Look, this chemical is fine." So you took the report and you went to FDA if it was drug, or you went to EPA if it was a pesticide, and they approved it. So you began to sell this stuff. And Adrian Gross, joined EPA. They brought him to EPA to do something to improve the morale and everything else of the toxicology division. So Adrian Gross and I got to know each other, and we had our offices close to each other. And so he gave me everything he wrote. And I still remember him. He would type his own memos, of hours, memos, 30-page memos, single space. For instance, malathion is a carcinogen. He would prove how malathion was carcinogenic and so on. And I kept asking Adrian, I said, "How did you discover this fraud?" "Oh," he said, "it was simple." He He said, I went there, and when I went for the inspection, I asked, give me the report for what happened, so let's say yesterday, and the clerk gave me a piece of paper written in pencil, numbers very neatly next to each other about the animals that were being experimented and the effects of the chemical that they use in the food of the animals. And she said, I know, I have worked in the laboratory, and I know in the laboratory you cannot be that neat. You don't use a pencil, and just as if you're typing. So he said that put some idea in my head that something was not quite right. So I went back to FDA, and I brought a whole team of inspectors, and we went there and we did an unannounced inspection. And there, this is where they discovered. They discovered the laboratory was making things up. Animals were running in the corridors. Employees with tiny little gas bottles that were running after the animals. It was a mess. So now EPA is facing this dilemma, a great dilemma. This is 1976. And we're talking about 1980, 4 years later. They didn't know what to do. So I remember being at a meeting with all the senior officials, and one of them said, we just received orders from the White House that we are not going to bother the chemical industry. We're going to focus on the laboratory only. We're going to shut down the laboratory. Indeed, Monsanto has had its own man in the laboratory supervising the faking of their own studies. Think of that, what I just said. So it was a massive fraud. But the Jimmy Carter administration, this is not the Republican, this is a Democrat administration, decided not to do anything to Monsanto or to anybody else except shut the laboratory down. And it took EPA down to 1983 to shut it down. There was a big trial in Chicago, 70,000 pages of transcript out of the trial. The conclusion was 570 pages, which I used. And finally, they did shut it down. But then, what to do? After all, hundreds of chemicals had been registered, approved, because of this kind of fraud. So what do you do? For me, if I was running the EPA, I would withdraw all the chemicals off the market that had been registered because of this fraud. Oh, he said, we can't do that. And EPA had its spokesperson say, well, we have complementary studies. Don't worry about the effects. We have complementary studies. Besides, we're going to order them to repeat the studies. But then repeating the study takes 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Meanwhile, the chemical is out in the market and gets into your food and drinking water, right? And some of these chemicals are very toxic. There could be organophosphates, carbamates, very nasty stuff. So it was this coming face to face with this reality, talking to Adrian Gross extensively, learning the history of this, reading the transcripts of the trial, and seeing the reaction of the EPA that really turned me like this. I said, this is completely outrageous, what's going on? And yet, despite that, we had a Democratic administration who accepted the results of all this systematic fraud, and they were going to do business as usual to continue to do this. I could tell you a lot of other stories, but what I will do instead, I will follow up with the slides and see what we see. These pesticides, as I said, some of them are really related to chemical warfare agents, and they should not be used in agriculture because they do, as Rachel Carson pointed out very correctly, they are devastating to the life of the insects and to the birds and other wildlife. I mean, you need only parts per trillion, per billion of some chemical like the very popular chemical that is used today, the glyphosate or Roundup, to kill the salmon in a river. Parts per billion will kill the salmon. It will destroy its ability to smell, to discover where food is, and to discover where the enemy is so he can avoid the enemy, they can avoid the enemy. So we are not really talking about little damage. They kill they kill, you know, insects, but insects are necessary food for birds. So for all these reasons, the ecocidal effects are not really very, very small. They're tremendous. And then, of course, they have us. We eat the food. Because once you have a helicopter, wait a second, I've got before. You have this airplane spraying chemicals. Out of whatever the tank that is spraying the chemical down, only 0.1% ever reaches either a weed or an insect. What happens to the rest? The rest of the chemical volatilizes, becomes gas, like gas, goes up in the air. It can move 5 miles, it can move 10 miles and drop down with rain, fog, snow, whatever. And let's assume that 10 miles away you have an organic orchard, right? And the stuff goes on the organic food. Then what happens to that organic food? It's no longer organic, right? And in fact, as we speak right now in the country, there is a big fight between farmers. Why? Because there's a chemical known as dicamba. It's a kind of it's a weed killer. But it volatilizes so fast, so it travels far and drops down and kills tomatoes, anything with broad leaf. And now farmers, in fact, there was in Missouri, one farmer killed another farmer because they had this bitter fight over your chemical, kill my tomatoes and stop it and so on and so on. And this administration we have now with Trump, they immediately approve the spraying of this chemical because, you know, Mr. Trump is imitating Reagan. And you will see further, I have a lot of slides about Reagan. And they did it carelessly, and now Monsanto now is a subsidiary of a German company, and they are spending millions defending themselves, but at the same time they make much more money because the farmers now, they have been using this form of agriculture for decades, so they have begun to unlearn ways of raising food without these chemicals. And you have the land-grant university system that provides it's like the brain. I call the land-grant universities the brain of agribusiness. Now, who are the land-grant university scientists? We have funded them. University of California has Davis, Riverside. These are the land-grant universities of California. Each state has a land-grant university. In 2003, 2004, I taught at the University of Maryland, which is a land-grant university. And so it was a relatively large department. I was teaching a class about sustainable agriculture, and another colleague who brought me there, he was a soil scientist. And it was only that person and I that used the terms organic farming, family farming, sustainable agriculture. And I discovered the rest of the colleagues, they were not using these terms. I said, why? And he said to me, one of them said to me, if we start using the term sustainable agriculture, it means that what we have been doing up to now is not sustainable. So for personal reasons, they were teaching their students something that's completely inimical to actually doing good farming, sustainable agriculture. These are pictures that come out of the 80s, the decade of the 80s from the state of Iowa. But not much has changed. I'll show you what has changed is the size of the machines. Here is where you see the farmers, or rather before spraying, they have to mix the chemicals. And in the mixing of the chemicals, in other words, what happens? Okay, you have, this is a little bit technical, but it's not too technical. You have somebody invents something, they call it active ingredient, let's say DDT or whatever. And they assume this is going to kill the insect that you want it dead. So they take it to a laboratory to test it. And let's assume that the testing was perfect and the chemical begins to be used. But the farmer never uses DDT. He uses DDT plus a number of other chemicals. They mix them up with a number of other chemicals. And it's that several chemicals together that eventually gets into the airplane to be sprayed. But nobody knows anything about this mixture. They know a lot about the one chemical, that is the active ingredient. And to make things even more complicated, EPA, unfortunately, they use this misnomer. They call them, what do they call them? They call them something like water. I mean, that they're neutral. They don't cause any effect. And yet some of the chemicals that they mix the active ingredient are more toxic than the active ingredient. So they take, for instance, chemicals which have been banned, like DDT, and they mix them up with the other chemical, and it's perfectly legal to use them. This is one of the kind of crazy things that have taken place. And you can see now these guys that are mixing the chemicals, you know, they're exposed, they're dangerous. This guy, you can see no protection, no cover, they breathe them, probably something falls on their skin. So here is what has changed, as I said, from the 80s now, this is a relatively recent sprayer. Look at this, it looks like a giant machine out of another planet. In California, I have visited the Central Valley. I have gone to Coachella. I have been to the Imperial Valley. I have taken pictures. I have written articles. And I would recommend that since you are up here, you should visit some of these agricultural areas so you can understand that while you can criticize pesticides for doing this nasty stuff, it's the agricultural system that demands and relies on those chemicals to continue to do what they do. In other words, the pesticides, the chemical pesticides, are like the glue that keeps the whole system as is. And the machinery, and of course, needless to say, all these machineries use petroleum. And petroleum, of course, is a global warming material. I mean, you burn it and immediately goes up in the atmosphere. It captures solar energy and stays there for a long time, CO2. And then this form of agriculture, as we will see in a second, produces, of course, trash, tons of trash. In this, I have a number of cartoons that they exaggerate, of course, but they tell the story to some degree. And here is something that is really very important. In 1969, remember Rachel Carson published her book in 1962. She died in 64. And in 69, this Department of what it used to be Health, Education, and Welfare published this report. The only report I have ever seen that connects environment and health. So what did they discover? One of the many discoveries is this. Look at the table. You would never have suspected that, I don't think. If you're poor and you eat bad food, here is what you get. You get poison, double the amount of poison in your blood than if you spend more money and buy good quality food and so on. And we knew about this, so this is 1969. Have you ever heard any discussion about this? Of course not. No, they buried the report. I have the report. It's a very huge report, very well done. And they discover this and they ignore it. You know, this is about DDT and all this. Same thing with the distribution in states and so on. So in the 80s, I remember now very well, it's the Reagan administration coming to power. And as I said, Mr. Trump is simply imitating the Reagan administration by the book. In fact, the Reagan administration had a Vice President, Bush, the old senior Bush, the father of George W. Guess what he did for 8 years, the senior Bush? He created a commission for deregulation. You understand what deregulation means? This is what Trump has been doing. So if there was a rule that said, the coal miner, you cannot dump your stuff on the creek. Guess what the regulation means? Now you can dump your stuff on the creek. So you poison the water, you destroy the fishery, and this is called deregulation. So here is the Washington Post. It had a fantastic kind of a cartoonist. This is, as you can see, 1980, and then September 10. And so you have double barrel attack. So you have the chemical industry lobby, and you have the chemical dumping. And dumping, of course, is another huge problem. In fact, I remember, again, listening to my colleagues complaining that these people, some of the companies had almost like a gangster activities. They would drive trucks in the middle of the night, and they would let their waste leak and dump them on the street. North Carolina, South Carolina, Illinois, or whatever. It's another cartoon. Says, so it is a critique of the EPA, of course. This is, it's easy to criticize EPA, as I have been doing, and they deserve the criticism, of course. But the criticism is much bigger than that of EPA, because EPA, after all, is one of the federal agencies, and who runs EPA? The person who runs EPA is the political appointee. Who chooses the political appointee? The president. And this political appointee reports to the president directly, to the Office of the Management and Budget. They run the EPA. So yes, the EPA does this nasty stuff, but you ought to go beyond the appearances and go to the substance. And the substance is that we have a political system that actually agrees on this. That is, both Republicans and Democrats agree that the environment is something that you can just keep hurting. And this is a little bit exaggerated, but it's not too far. It says EPA and chemical companies in one department, more or less. And then you have Department of the Interior. It's a branch of the Treasury. Yeah. And then Department of Defense is a branch of the arms manufacturing and so on. And within the EPA, of course, during the Reagan administration was quite an upheaval. I mean, it was a lot of people were very angry. Not only they started firing people. In fact, the first act of Gorsuch, Ann Gorsuch, the first administrator of EPA under Reagan, her son, by the way, became the new Supreme Court justice not long ago. Anyway, this Mrs. Gorsuch got to Washington. The first thing she did was to fire all the lawyers that were defending the laws. I mean, you have to have legal stuff to understand the law, and when the laws are violated, to actually sue them. And they use the Department of Justice to do the suing of the polluters. So within the EPA, there was, people were frightened and they were doing all sorts of things. And here is a nice picture that tells you to some degree, schematically, that is how the government agency was used in the Reagan administration. I only tell you that what happened in the 80s is happening as we speak, right now. Because Mr. Trump doesn't give a damn about the environment. Clearly, he gave, $1.5 trillion to the very wealthy and to major corporations. And he has put a straitjacket in EPA. He appointed his man. Because of his corruption, they fired him. Now he has another guy to run the EPA. And this man is going to do even more damage to EPA because he's an insider. He knows how Washington works. And that's what, now you can see Mrs. Gorsuch, I spoke a second ago, says would like to send an international Red Cross inspection team within the EPA. EPA behind the fence, as you can see. So this cartoonist actually got the spirit of what really was going on. So you can express the truth in many, many ways. And he captured the essence of the truth very beautifully here. This is a woman from California. She wrote a letter. This is a letter she wrote to the EPA Office of Pesticide Programs. And you can see, say, are you serious? You people must be insane. So on and so on. Even wildlife was terribly upset about all this. And this farmer, it says to his wife, it's a letter from the USDA about farm chemicals. They want us to forget the BS they have been telling us for 40 years and go back to using manure. And of course, this is another cartoon. It says, Arthur, is there room for any more agencies in Washington, D.C.? Just one more, an agency to protect the environment from the Environmental Protection Agency. How ironic. So, and this one again talks about water. It says, we don't bother buying pesticides anymore. We just spray the crops with our own groundwater. Think of that. And here, I love this picture because it shows one of the major defects we have in the regulatory system. We have the revolving door. That is, for a second, I imagine that Reagan or somebody appointed me, so I served for 4 years. And then what I'm doing is I'm moving straight to the offices of Dow Chemical, Monsanto, Syngenta, whatever. And why would they pay me 5 to 6 times more money than I actually made before? Because I have the inside, I have the telephones, I have the emails, I know personally people, because I used to be their political boss, they respect me, they love me, and so on. And that's the kind of knowledge and connections that the industry buys by hiring political appointees from the government to work for them. This is what's happening. So the first thing that anybody must do if they are ever serious about environmental protection is to abolish, to prohibit any of these things to go on. You work for Dow Chemical, you cannot work for the government. You work for the EPA and you regulated X industry, you can never work for that industry, period. If you do that, you cut off all these connections and you make it far more difficult for the industry to influence EPA. How do they influence EPA? I'll tell you. 25 years I must have been invited several times to go to what they call, they have meetings. So they say, next Thursday, they invite you, they pay your airplane, and they send you to Hawaii. So you have 500 people from EPA or the federal government joining Hawaii, beautiful hotels, and they have people from the industry there with slideshows and nicely dressed, and they come there and they begin to talk like this. They talk like scholars or scientists. But the whole idea is not that. The idea is to, in the evening, when they have cocktails and they have parties and they talk to each other, they exchange cards. And that's how they begin the corruption, the process of corruption. So let's say I go back to my Washington and then I get an email or a telephone call. They say, hey, doctor, you remember we met at this? Oh, yes, I do. And I have sent a petition and for this new chemical that we are developing, and we would like to know how you and your colleagues feel about it. Can you come back to me in 2 weeks, something like that? And if you say no, that person will pick up the phone and call a congressman, his congressman, who, of course, his money is supported to be a congressman. And that congressman feels obliged to return the favor. So he will call, if not me, he will call my boss. And if not the boss, then he will call directly the administrator and say, this is what's going on. So that's how things get done in Washington, D.C. And of course, these are the beneficiaries. Fat cigars, smoke, who cares? They make lots of money. Because without the government approval, none of what you have in your water and air would exist. In other words, EPA provides the legal protection, because once a product gets approved by the government, you cannot sue the government. You cannot sue the company. So you go sue the government. Here's my paper. They approved it that 7 parts per million, the bananas of this chemical is legal. That's it. And they go on their business. This is business as usual. This is a wonderful cartoon. I found it in a Greek magazine out of 1976, I think, someplace like this. And you can, I mean, on the left you have this guy presents, this is the authority of the state, a policeman. He talks to these polluters, and they look at him and they keep pumping this stuff into the water or the ocean or whatever it is. They have become the new kind of medieval lords on this planet. That is, these gigantic corporations, like Monsanto was purchased for $62 billion, $62.5 billion by Bayer, a German company. And Bayer, of course, came up with this neurotoxin, neonicotinoids, that is wiping out honeybees all over the world, especially in the United States. And Bayer has a terrible, dirty history going up to the Nazis, World War II, with the chemical warfare stuff. Now, back to this country. Here is the nice, very interesting kind of conception of what happens with pollution. Pollution is not abstract. you know, the stuff that goes up in the air doesn't just disappear. It's moved by the air. Some of it drops to the water comes in front of your house. Some of the water pollutes the drinking water, the groundwater, and then you suck up the drinking water to drink, and then you get this stuff. So there's kind of a circle. And then, of course, you have the people getting sick. And then, of course, you run them into the hospital. And who runs the hospital? The same characters. And this one is about the science. Science, what do we mean by science? Technical knowledge to find out something. Okay, you test it, you take the water in your laboratory, you find out, and you have sophisticated machinery to determine in parts per billion or whatever how much of the stuff may be in the drinking water. And what are you going to do about it? Says no problem. Trust me, in every case where it is, DDT, no problem. Malathion, no problem. Trust me, and so on. And this is what you get. I mean, I have been watching PBS television for decades. By the way, I have been in this country since 1961. I got all my education in this country and so on. And I have been watching almost religiously PBS. I have read, almost, I wouldn't say never, but I don't think I have seen any documentary by PBS that explores this kind of questions. Now, why would not PBS explore these questions? After all, they do documentaries on everything you can imagine under the sun. Never touch agriculture. Why not? Think about it. And of course, commercial television, forget it. Because you see all this stuff advertised on commercial television, how nice, how safe they may be. They are, all this malathion stuff, no problem. And the people who benefit, of course, they feel sometimes guilty, have a guilt complex, and they pray to the divine Lord, whatever, forgive me for all this. And here is the beneficiaries. So you have here Monsanto, Dow Chemical, and this is about the Agent Orange. I remember what was Agent Orange? It was 2,4-D, 2,4,5-T, 2 weed killers that the US Army used in the war in Vietnam. And they drenched the country with this kind of chemical. They wiped out millions of trees. And of course, they killed a lot of rice fields in order to win the war. And of course, they didn't win the war. Not only that, but the people, the American soldiers spraying this chemical, all of them came down, or rather many of them came down with all sorts of lymphomas, cancer. In Alexandria, Virginia, where I was for probably 30 years, my next door neighbor was a guy, he had a lovely dog. I had a dog. We used to walk the dogs and talk. He started telling me the stories from Vietnam. He was in Vietnam. He was in this program of spraying the Agent Orange. And he died. I mean, it's a lot of, and then of course there was the whole fraud of the US government denying that there was any connection between the health effects on these poor people that had fought the war in Vietnam and they were dying from cancer with the spraying of this chemical. Why? And the only way that the news came out was for another little story, which I'm going to tell you right now. There was a community in Oregon, women usually, and the Forest Service used to spray, and they used to spray these chemicals in Oregon. They did it in Vietnam, but they did it in Oregon as well. So these women noticed they couldn't get pregnant, number one. Number two, those that had children, they had cases where they were anencephalic babies. Babies born without brains. So they wrote they got together, they wrote a letter to the administrator. And this is 1977, 78. And the administrator was a nice guy then, unfortunately, and he sent a team of scientists to this community in Alsea, Oregon. And they discovered this tetrodotoxin in the creek. Now, dioxin, nobody manufactures dioxin, but it's a contaminant of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. So once they discovered the tetrodotoxin, they knew that the problem of the anencephalic babies was a result of the parts per trillion. Can you imagine what a part per trillion is? It's almost, you can't see it, it's infinitely small. but yet it has infinitely potential, tremendous potential to cause damage, cancer, and so on. So it was that discovery that eventually killed 2,4,5-T. That is, EPA banned it in 1983. But in the process of negotiating with Dow Chemical, this is what we have found. We're going to take this action against your chemical. I don't know now that this happened, but I suspect that in those negotiations, EPA agreed with Dow Chemical, we are not going to touch you 2,4-D. 2,4-D is still very much in practice right now as we speak. Not only that, but they use it in the genetic engineering of crops. That is, they manipulate the genetic stuff of, let's say, corn, so that if that corn gets sprayed by 2,4-D, everything dies except the corn. So the farmer can send a helicopter or an airplane, because these farms today are gigantic, and they kill everything except the corn. But in the process, of course, this stuff is used excessively, perhaps, and it ends up into the creek, and ends up killing fish. It kills birds of prey that eat the fish, which have been contaminated by this. So you have this chain of evil. And well, this one is another guilt complex that they go to the church for absolution of their sins. This is again the circle of violence, you know, from the chimney to the water back to, and the people pay the price for that. And here is a personal story. EPA sent me to a number of universities to teach. Probably they did it because they didn't like me. But in a sense, this is done when they really, it's an honor to, because the government pays all the expenses. They sent you. I was in Northern California. I was at Humboldt State University when I wrote this article. And the Chicago Tribune published it. Nothing happened. 6 months later, 2-3 paragraphs where I'm very critical of the chemical industry are reprinted by the Wall Street Journal. And it happened to be Earth Day, 1990, April 20 or 21st, 1990. That very day, I see a letter of reprimand on my desk. Now, a letter of reprimand is the first step before they fire you. So, fortunately, I knew the administrator. His daughter, my daughter, were going to the same school. So I take the letter, I go straight to the administrator. He takes a look and says, this is ridiculous. So he just tore it. He said, forget it. So he had his assistant tell my bosses to just leave me alone. But you know, this is the kind of thing that happens to you, and you know, it stays with you. And then, this comes from an experience, again, I was teaching at the University of New Orleans. And look at the numbers about Louisiana.
Hard to read from here. It's hard to read from here.
Okay, so they say here, poison surface waters, discharges. First, says, yeah, God, I have to put my glasses too, just a second.
The top line is really important. There's that poison scoreboard.
It's a big number, isn't it?
And then it's 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah. Well, it says here, poison surface water discharges. Pounds, so they have pounds per capita and so on. Well, anyway, the state of Louisiana is first in the poison surface water. Number 2 in the commercial fish caught in the U.S. Second in poisonous underground injection. You understand the implications of this? Second, important poisonous waste. Second, in overall discharge of poisons. Second, in the discharge of carcinogens. Fourth, in the poisonous air discharges. Fifth, in the cancer death rate. Fifth, in the worst residential general health quality. It's really bad. When I was teaching there, I took my students for kind of a brief field trip between Baton Rouge, is the capital, and I was teaching at New Orleans. It's 100 miles, and usually they call it cancer corridor. You have incinerators, you have refineries, you have all sorts of chemical industry factories. So I said to the dean, I said, I need two big cars so I can take 30 students. And he asked me, what do you plan to do? And I explained. He said, oh, no, you're not going to use university cars for that. I said, why not? I said, after all, we're studying the environment, or we want to. He said, no, no, if I let you go, what do you think the industry is going to tell us about us? I said, what are they going to say?
No money.
So, okay, you can't do that. I said, no, thank you, Dean, goodbye. And I went and I said to the students, we're going to go, but we're going to drive. So we found 5 cars and we drove, and we did what we had to do. Needless to say, I was there for only 1 year. I keep all this about the EPA during the Reagan administration because the same things are happening as we speak. This is the organophosphates, the neurotoxins. And this guy on the right, it looks to me like President Clinton. But talking about the Clinton administration, this is, again, as I said before, both the Republicans and the Democrats agree on this question of pollution. They are not challenging the industry at all. During the Clinton administration in 1996, they revised the Pesticides Act, and what they did, they had a kind of there was a provision in the federal law that said you cannot allow a carcinogen to get into raw agricultural commodities. No, processed food. No carcinogens in processed food, which is good, right? So you would think that they would actually say no carcinogen in raw agricultural commodities. No, they were having struggle, they were having problems because the people at the EPA that were investigating the petitions from the industry, they could see that most of the processed food had already carcinogens. So therefore, they were actually violating the law. So to stop violating the law, they suggested, let's just eliminate this provision. Instead of trying to face the problem and correct it, they said, let's just eliminate this. It causes inequality. Think of it. It just infuriated the hell out of me and a lot of other people as well. So the day the law passed, and they finally eliminated this provision, which the official name was Delaney Clause. Delaney was a congressman from Illinois that had in '57 put it into the books, into the law. So the night they finally managed to pass the law in 1996 under the Clinton administration, we had hundreds of federal employees from the White House, from the Office of the Management and Budget, from the industry, from EPA, from FDA. They all came to the EPA to celebrate. Think of what I'm saying. They came to celebrate what? They came to celebrate the defeat of the only provision in the federal legislation that prohibited carcinogens in food. Now, does that make Clinton any better or worse than Reagan? He wasn't as destructive as Reagan, but yes, certainly he was not something that you might feel proud of. This country is exporting a lot of chemicals, of course, and this is about the chemical EDB. I don't know if any of you remember it, but it was another ethylene dibromide, another powerful carcinogen that was, of course, getting into our food and water and so on. Since we're talking about that, I remember when I was teaching at Humboldt State University, one of my students, they were writing research papers for me, and he said, I live in an area that we have only one drinking water place from which we can take our water. Other than that, you have to travel far to find another well. And I said, what, is there any problem? He said, yes. That water, they found it had DBCP, dibromochloropropane. And what was that? It was a liquid that if you ate it, and if you're a man, it made you impotent. However you want to describe it, polite or impolite, it just, you couldn't be able to have a baby. And he said, so he admitted, there's no other water for us to drink, except we have to continue to drink that water. Think of look at the dilemma of a young man at 20 years old telling you this story. Not exactly pleasant. There's the better things, better living through chemistry. And this young mother, It says, careful about fruits and apple juice. Avoid taking deep breaths outdoors. Children from Alar in U.S. apples and air pollution. Alar was another chemical that was causing trouble, and this chemical really was there. They were sprayed it in order to keep the apples a little bit longer on the tree. And here is the beginning of the biotechnology or genetic engineering of crops. And this happened in the 90s again under the Clinton administration. In fact, I have my office right here, and next to me was a big division, about 80 people, 80 men and women. They all were working for the development of this genetic engineering of food. And what do they do with that? They simply take the genes from one species, they shoot them into the genetic material of another species. And then, of course, the idea is the new species that develops out of this shooting of the material, is it identical to the original or not? And I don't think it is identical. But this is the conclusion of the FDA. They said, it doesn't matter what we do, both are the same. That is, genetically engineered corn and non-genetically engineered corn are identical. This is what they said. And this is what we have today. And here is from California again. This is a very interesting kind of high science fiction cartoon. But sure, I'm worried about the pesticide, but I have really gotten used to this mellow, laid-back California lifestyle. And here is another cartoon about the sort of chemical I spoke before, DBCP. It says, I'm afraid this study shows that the number of our chemical workers have become sterile. Well, birth control is an extra, docket from their pay. This is what the boss is saying here on the right. And this is, again, the different chemical companies that cooperate and are working on this genetic engineering of food. It's another monstrosity of this chemical. Of course, it's hypothetical, but nevertheless, it tells you you have a boy born with 2 heads. And officials say cancer from chlordane exposure is remote. Chlordane is like DDT, organochlorine. And then, of course, the other head says, come on, I want to read it too. And finally, this is about Monsanto. And he's talking about his most popular chemical, of course, being that of glyphosate or Roundup. And this is the genetically engineered force. And this is the political context of agriculture. So this old teacher tells the young boy in India, what does agriculture mean? And the young boy says, it is 10% cultivation, 80% exploitation, and 10% agitation. It remains true to this very day. And in Latin America, for instance, this is exactly what happened. That is, you have the gigantic tractor, or rather the big companies or whatever, with money and influence. They push the farm worker off the land, or they push the peasant off the land, which is what I described in my 1976 book, Fear in the Countryside. And the transformation of agriculture in the United States from a solar, using the sun for energy, now we're going to the petroleum, and all the machinery is 100% hooked on petroleum. And the size of the machines, as you noticed before, it's gigantic. And therefore, agriculture is a major source of global warming. Indeed, I have seen studies that from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization saying that 18% of all the global warming gases come from agriculture. Some people go up to 40%. So it's a gigantic source of global warming. And look at the size of the sun. I mean, when I'm in the Imperial Valley or any other, you don't see any borders anymore. You don't know what planet are you in, because it's gigantic and the same in one, flat as your eyesight allow you to see. And this is from Coachella Valley. And this is a picture I took from in the Central Valley. This is a relatively small farm, but nevertheless, look how the animals are. And this is the spraying within the greenhouse. And now we come to the last version of all these chemicals with the Zika virus, starting in Miami, 2 years ago when, especially during the time of the Olympics in Brazil, and the people are protesting that, you know, they say, look, it's not just the Zika virus that is causing the microcephaly, that is the birth of babies with a tiny brain and tiny head. It may be something more than that they're supposed to. This is the Centers for Disease Control. This is this is how they picture the difference in size between the heads of the microcephalic baby and versus the healthy baby. And this is a mother from northeast Brazil with a little daughter born with microcephaly. And finally, the Brazilian government enforced its rules of spraying with the military. And finally, this is my book. And what I did try to in this book, for instance, what I tried to do is, because I was there for 25 years and I made a lot of friends and I made a lot of enemies too. But the people who liked me, we used to get together for lunch, they would bring to me their own studies, their own reports they had about the chemicals that they were in charge. So slowly, I had a small library. And on the basis of those reports, the scientific studies, I wrote this book. This is the only book in existence that actually describes the conditions between the chemical industry and EPA based on official government documents. I could not do this work today because it's just, by the time the Obama administration got into power, no one could do something like this because they put so much restrictions you could not even give your own memorandum to your colleague. And before that, we had the freedom, and they gave me their reports, and this is what I did. And I did it. I did it because I thought this was the least I could do to inform the American people that the system we have is unsustainable. It's hazardous, it's destroying the natural world, and it's actually threatening our own health. And I hope the more people read this book, the more perhaps they will get so upset and they will demand to change. And if they were to conceive of an idea of what they should do, number one, as we said, we should not allow politicians to become, from EPA to the industry and vice versa. Number two, I would create an EPA that would be completely independent of the president and Congress. It would be something like what we have in the Federal Reserve, or something we have, Federal Reserve or the Supreme Court. It's kind of an independent institution, gets funded, but you cannot just order people to do your bidding because you destroy the credibility and you challenge the very idea of doing science. And if we do that, then we get into kind of a barbarian state because science is what connects us to civilization. We can make a decision based on a kind of an objective way of doing things. And we look at the public good that way. Otherwise, we just serve your interest and my interest, nobody else's interest. So, in fact, there should be part of that legislation. It should prohibit industry from lobbying EPA. No one should ever come to the EPA to ask for a petition or a favor. And as part of that also, I would include creation of a national laboratory that if need be, and you wanted to register something, you would come to the government, you would pay me, and we would do an objective study and say, your chemical can be used. No, your chemical cannot be used because it causes A, B, C, D effects on both the wildlife and us, human beings. And with that, I thank you very much.
Okay, so we have some time for some questions here.
Are there any countries that you know of that do it correctly?
No. I mean, the Europeans, they have a little bit better system of assessing the risks of a chemical, but regrettably, the chemical companies like Monsanto are so powerful that they, in the UK and Germany and France, they follow the US model. So when EPA approves or does something, it becomes a global decision, more or less. Bangladesh doesn't have the money to test, and so they simply say, if it was approved by the US, it must be good for us. Same thing, Russia, China, the same thing. They don't repeat the testing. So everything that we do here, it becomes a global decision. So no, there's no. And of course, to eliminate the problem of this corruption, another way to do it is to strengthen traditional and organic farming. These chemicals are completely useless. They sometimes kill insects, sometimes they kill weeds, but then they create all these horrendous consequences in the natural world. Not only they wipe out insects and birds and so on, but they make weeds that are actually resistant to any chemical you throw at them. And give another few decades, you won't be able to farm. I mean, they're killing the life in the soil. The soil is not dead. It's full of organic material and microorganisms. In fact, there's a former professor from Purdue University, Dan Huber. He's saying the following: if glyphosate, the so-called Roundup, you spray it, what happens? The chemical goes under the surface of the land, and it kills the good bugs, microorganisms, who transfer nutrients from the soil to the hair of the roots of the plant that you're growing. So, and then it promotes the bad microorganisms that give disease, so to speak. So that you eat food now, but the food is not as nutritious as it would be without the use of those chemicals. Think of that alone.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. Very enlightening. Some of the scenarios you talked about in the beginning, where people are being flown off to locations and attending lavish parties and stuff like that, I actually recognize that. I mean, that's actually bribery, and bribery is illegal according to my understanding of.
Me too.
To bribe a public official is illegal in the United States. And I just wonder, what's your comment about that? Is this everybody's just nodding and winking and turning a blind eye to this, or who would enforce this kind of bribery?
You know, it is a bribery, but it's not considered bribery because it's not, nobody's paying money. No money exchanges hands.
No, it doesn't have to be money. It's
yeah.
an exchange of value.
In fact, it is very curious that the ethical laws of the U.S. allow this sort of thing to happen.
Yeah. If I were to bring a government official to my company here, to my company cafe, that's all right, it doesn't matter the name, and I would have to get approval. It's considered a possible bribe.
Yeah, it should be.
I mean, and you're talking about things that are way more valuable. An airline ticket, which is hundreds or maybe thousands if it's first class, right? This is value. This is bribery as far as I can tell.
And by the way, when they take government people and send them to Hawaii, the money comes from the industry. The industry pays for the airplane and the hotel and the food and everything else. But the ethical officers, the people of the ethics officers of EPA, they say it's perfectly legal. But I agree with you. They should not. This sort of thing should stop immediately. Yeah,
I just want to interject a question here as well. I mean, I had a friend who was kind of a environmental keeper for executives at a big company, and he managed their land and all. And he was the first one that kind of said, "Look, our bodies are just like an environment, just like like the planet is, right? And all the land that we have, it's all the same thing." Because you talked about bugs, we have bugs in our gut, just like it's in the soil. So, it's amazing to me that we function at all with the toxins that we're exposed to in the world today. But, where is it going, and what's the positive? Is there an upside at all, or what can be good?
In addition to, if we were in a position to have honest politicians and reform EPA, the things that you and I can do is what I have been doing for 30 years. Eat organic food. Never taste anything that is not organic, because your money will go there to support farmers who are actually trying to do the right thing, raise food in the way that we have been raised in for millennia. That way they would teach the big boys a lesson, that the stuff that is shiny in the grocery store will not be purchased. I go to Trader Joe's, and occasionally I said, "You have organic tomatoes," and then the others called individual tomatoes. I said, "What is that supposed to mean, individual?" Say they are poison tomatoes. That's what they are. In fact, they are. This is not, he said, you speak too directly, too loud, and so on. I said, no, this is the evidence. Otherwise, it would be certified organic.
So my following question is about that organic. Can you trust the USDA organic certification?
Yeah.
And is organic means is it truly non-GMO, and how much can you trust? I guess that's the question.
Well, I mean, some people say the organic farmers also do all sorts of illegal things. They may spray and so on. Yeah, I mean, you cannot have a perfect society. And among the organic farmers, some people are misusing the law. But the penalties are very severe. If they get caught, they're out of business. And if the system works as it's designed to go, they go and test the soil. And if they find the malathions, the parathions, you're done for. So it's to your own interest not to use the chemicals. And then the price you charge for the tomato is double the price of the conventional. So why would you do that? You must be stupid if you do that. You're making more money, and you are producing something that is actually good for you, for your children, plus for me, that I'm going to buy your food. Now, the genetic engineering, again, is causing, there is tremendous evidence, scientific evidence, that the genetic engineered plant is not what you started with, the conventional. So therefore, to eat the genetic engineered corn or soybeans, you're pushing yourself at risk. Now, to what extent that risk may cause some certain disease, I'm not sure, but I'm sure, however, that it's not good for you. And there are people that are experts on genetic engineering who might actually tell you exactly what kind of disease this genetic engineering of crops may cause.
But if it is certified USDA organic, is it guaranteed that it's not GMO?
I didn't get it.
It's not genetically modified. It's non-GMO.
What's the question?
It's organic,
If it's labeled as organic, USDA, certified organic, is it a guarantee that it's pure?
Yeah. It is
No
guaranteed.
GMO. No GMO in organic food.
Well, first of all, in organic, the organic law forbids any genetic engineering of crops. It's the only protection you have is to eat organic food. So you never eat genetically engineered food. Because the organic law says you cannot use sludge, you cannot use genetic engineering, you cannot use radiation or any other. It has to be synthetic, it has to be, and not synthetic chemicals. No synthetic fertilizers or synthetic insecticides or anything like that. So it's the only hope we have to eat healthy food if we eat the certified organic food. That's.
So that would mean that hydroponic foods would be not organic?
I don't know.
The question was, are hydroponic foods organic? Sorry, go ahead.
Are they certified organic? They must be certified organic. If they label it organic, they must.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment that I'm skeptical about the organic label, because I recall one time being at a farmer's market and there was like the organic and the non-organic, and they both look great. And I asked the non-organic vendor, I go, well, why isn't your stuff organic? He goes, well, I used some fertilizer, so I can't call it organic. And I don't know, I'm not against all kinds of fertilizer, so I was kind of surprised about that. It makes me kind of skeptical about the whole classification about what it means.
The synthetic fertilizers are petroleum product.
Well, but if it was a synthetic fertilizer, we didn't get into detail of what kind of fertilizer it was, I guess, but suppose you threw some steer manure on your...
If you have animals, if you have chickens and hogs and so on, and those animals are fed organic food, then you can use their manure and that's the organic fertilizer. But if you feed your animals conventional stuff, then you cannot say that the animal is also the meat.
I guess I should go read up on it. Okay, hands are popping up. Here we go.
Remember that we're recording, so you need the mic before you speak. Thank you.
Do you have any information on these so-called chemtrails? These are
No, I really don't know. No.
Okay.
I had a question about production, and they use the excuse of having genetically modified growth and all these pesticides to increase the speed of growth and also the volume to feed the world.
To feed $10 billion they project by 9.
Can organic gardening sustain the world? I mean, I eat organically, but I'm just wondering, we have to have each of us our own garden, basically.
That's
and what about the world? That is, I went to Indonesia. It's very interesting. This is a 94-year-old farmer, and he says, I feel sorry for my son. And I said, what do you mean? He said, we used to harvest the rice twice a year. The rice was healthier, more nutrition, we felt better. Now we have to harvest it 4 times a year, speeding it. They don't even let it stay in the soil, which is organic soil, long enough to get all the nutrients out so that the crop you eat is very vital to the human body or whatever. So, you know, I guess my question is, could we feed the whole world with organic?
Okay, yeah, this is one of the propaganda points that the industry does, that without the conventional agriculture, that is without using chemicals and fertilizers and so on, we're going to have massive hunger. Well, this was the idea of the Green Revolution. This is why I did my book in 1976. I published my first book in 1976. I'm a very old man. So in 1976, they were telling exactly this sort of thing. And in fact, the last chapter of my book, this book, I have a chapter where I use EPA data about a scientific study in the university, Michigan State University. And this woman professor, researcher, studied onions. So she had a farm of 10 acres, 50 acres, 100 acres. Some of it was conventional, some of it without chemicals. She discovered, number one, as far as the productivity, that the small farmer sometimes outproduces the large farmer per acre. We're talking about bushels per acre. And then in terms of the poisons, the smaller the farm, the fewer chemicals. The larger the farm, the more chemicals. So, your choice. So there is no problem about feeding the world. In fact, most of the world is being fed by traditional agriculture. The industrialized farmers all over the world feed no more than 30% of the population of the earth. 70% feeds itself. Most of Africa, most of Asia does not use chemicals, does not use genetic engineering food. Now, China, unfortunately, is moving in the direction of the US. And they have been to China twice, and they are trying to imitate the United States 100%. And that's bad, and I have told them that. But at the same time, China is also ambivalent about this modern way, and they keep talking about ecological civilization. Think of the idea, ecological civilization. What does it mean? Zero use of all this stuff. That means you go back to almost the pre-industrial age. But they do it as a way to convince themselves, and to the peasants in particular, that there's a way out. And they have 260 million peasants in China. So to industrialize 100% would be almost suicidal. What are they going to do with 260 million families? They're going to shoot them, put them up in skyscrapers? No way. So this is the ambivalence that they face. While in this country we have wiped out the small-scale farmers, almost. There are no black farmers left in the United States, almost. I wrote an article in, not long ago, I mean, in the 20th century alone, there was a 98% decline of black farmers in this country. 98% decline. At the same time, we had 60% decline of white farmers in this country. By now, there may be a few thousand left in the whole country. So is that appropriate? I don't think so. I mean, after all, the Civil War was fought, and they were promised 40 acres and a mule. How many 40 acres and a mule exist? So we really have to rethink about all these things. Pesticides, again, I repeat, they are just a symptom of a larger disease, nosus. And we need to deal with that big problem of agriculture. Why allow somebody to have 20,000 acres of land? What does he need that much land for? He's not producing more food for the world. No, he's going to get paid. He's been subsidized by Washington. $25 billion per year from Washington go to the large farmers. Not a penny goes to the small-scale farmer. and to the organic farmers, the small ones. I would reverse everything if I were the administrator. I would put the $25 billion to small-scale farmers, encourage people to become farmers once again. Order the land-grant universities to stop supporting agribusiness. Get them to do what their mission is. They were created by, in the 1860s, by President Lincoln. In fact, President Lincoln called the U.S. Department of Agriculture, called it the People's Department. You go to USDA now, you don't see people. You see agribusiness people with suits going there for an appointment. So we need to reverse of these values and look at our own public health, our own health, and the health of the natural world. If the natural world gets sick, forget it. You remember I started with Hippocrates. What did Hippocrates said? Water, air, and place are absolutely fundamental for public health, for our health, and the health of the community, of the city. And it's still true to this very day. In fact, more so now.
Okay, we have to wrap up. Let's give Dr. Vallianatos another round of applause. Thank you.